The hands-off rallies across the nation push back against the Trump administration, which early on has been characterized by layoffs, possible funding freezes, and the early volleys of a trade war. Lawmakers, including Washington Senator Maria Cantwell, try to reassert their authority over tariffs and trade. Meanwhile, despite what can be reasonably argued as a clunky implementation, the basic math problem, namely the country's $36 trillion national debt, is something politicians in both parties were eventually going to have to contend with, and that time may have come. So that's part of the discussion tonight with 10th District Congresswoman Marilyn Strickland and 2nd District Congressman Rick Larson. That's next on Northwest Now. Everybody would like the easy way out of running up $36 trillion on the nation's credit card. But as taxpayers in Washington state are about to find out, when expenditures exceed revenues, getting out of the jam is always painful. The fight is over how that pain is distributed. So putting all the social issues aside, both MAGA Republicans and the Democratic resistance are facing the same ugly reality, that the math isn't mathing, and that letting the good times roll puts the country on a collision course with even more pain in the future. Tax breaks and trickle down really hasn't worked. Stimulative giveaways just cause inflation and discourage participation in the labor force. So again, finding a path toward solvency is going to become an increasingly important part of any congressperson's job, and how you view the ultimate solution is why elections matter in ways that they maybe haven't before. Meanwhile, though, the country is in chaos with every government department, every institution, and every norm thrown into turmoil to facilitate what GOP voters wanted: rapid change and a disabled opposition. A quick note here in case you didn't know it. There are no congressional Republicans in our viewing area, and those out of our viewing area didn't respond to our inquiries. So let's start with the 10th District, Representative Marilyn Strickland. Do you think there's any method to Donald Trump and the Republicans' madness when it comes to finally maybe addressing the national debt and handing out some pain, and do you just assume let them do it?
So first of all, it's very nice to be here with you again, Tom, and with the KBTC family. As I think about the whole conversation with the Trump administration, the Republican Party, and the debt, I'll tell you a few high-level things that I've observed in the very short period of time. So number one, they are making these giant, inhumane cuts to very important essential services in the name of addressing national debt. But what's really happening is that the plan is to give away tax breaks to the super ultra wealthy. And in fact, it's actually going to add $7 billion of debt. And so I understand the desire to deal with debt, and I would advise a bipartisan commission to take a very thoughtful, strategic look. Let's use a scalpel and not a sledgehammer and a chainsaw to figure this out. But you know this, what you've seen is just this chaotic uncertainty. And it's uncertainty for people trying to pay their bills. We've talked about firings at the Veterans Administration, what's happening with Social Security Administration and the wait times people have to endure, and just this uncertainty about what's happening. I spoke with the CEO of a local retailer yesterday, and he said that this chaos with tariffs is not good for business. And so I think people are looking for certainty. I believe that people would like to see some bipartisan support, but let's do it methodically and strategically and not just randomly make these cuts and say it's good for the American people when it's not.
Aren't the tariffs supposed to pay for the tax cuts and those things?
That's what you heard, and these across-the-board tariffs went into place, and you saw the market respond very, very negatively. And then yesterday, the president says, oh, wait, we're going to do a pause on the tariffs. So the market came rallying back a bit. But you can't have this helter-skelter, uncertain business climate and say this is good public policy. And so again, and I want to point something out, Tom. The president of the United States does not have the authority to impose taxes or tariffs. That is a congressional action. So in addition to the uncertainty and chaos, this is simply unconstitutional and illegal what he's doing.
You've made the transition a couple of times into a section I have here called the trouble with chaos.
Right?
And what are constituents telling you specifically? You alluded to it, but when it comes to trying to plan personal finances, plan operating a small business to bring product in or to hold inventory or importing, exporting, those things. Are there boots on the ground implications of this in CD10?
Oh, of course there are. I mean, there are boots on the ground implications in the 10th congressional district and everyone across the state of Washington. And I want to remind folks of something. Washington state is the most trade dependent state in the entire nation. So we have growers in Eastern Washington growing wheat, apples, cherries, and they depend on international markets in Asia because they export a lot to them because they love our products. And so when you're imposing these random tariffs, it turns into this trade war and these retaliatory this retaliatory tariffs. And so what does that mean? It means that we pay more here in the United States. Random tariffs are not good for the American people because they will simply drive up the cost of what we pay for goods. And if you go around the house and look at where things are made that you wear, that you buy, that you use, a lot of them are imports. And so I don't think there's anything wrong with using tariffs in a very thoughtful, intentional, and strategic way to create more jobs at home and to make it more fair. But you can't just randomly slap on a tariff rate and think it's not going to have an effect on everyday people at home, what we pay, how it affects the supply chain for business, and how it affects small business.
We all like cheap stuff. I worked a lot in the Midwest, in Indiana and Kentucky and
Right.
places. I've been to those towns where the factory went away. We hollowed
Yeah.
out the middle class. The deal we made was cheap stuff for people with educations and who prepare files for work like me,
Right.
against hollowing out the middle class. Does Donald Trump have a point that we'll never make tennis shoes here because we just don't have the labor force and that's not going to happen? But is reshoring, is bringing some of this back to America where we don't have to hope that China will give us masks someday? Is that valid?
Oh, absolutely. And we learned this during the pandemic, Tom. Remember, there were basic supplies we needed, like masks, and we had to actually import them. So it totally makes sense to do our best to onshore the things that we want and need. We should have more American manufacturing. And to your point about some of these Midwest states that got hollowed out because some of these trade deals. But I also want to point out the fact that we, as US citizens and consumers, have an insatiable appetite for some of the products that we're talking about here and where they come from. So I think there's a way to bring onshoring back to the United States, but understand that applying tariffs across the board with no thought or care is not going to make these jobs magically appear and these factories automatically appear. That is a decades long process to buy property, to have certainty, to stand it up. You have to have the workers to work in the factories. And so I don't think anyone disagrees, Tom, with the idea of let's bring some jobs back to the United States, but let's do it with thought and care and not hurt the American people in the process.
One of the things I want to talk to you about too is governance from your
Mhm.
perspective.
Yeah.
Olympia Indivisible held an event at your office, not protesting against you, I want to make that clear, but calling for you to, quote, do something.
Yeah.
What can you possibly tell them? Is there any way to really kind of constructively resist as a D in our house? Can you help somehow try to shape policy and get in there and do anything? Or is it, sorry, folks, elections have consequences. Good luck with that.
So, when you hear from people who say do something, I think that there is a sincere, earnest desire to take action. And to your point about the limitations that we have as members of Congress, and I say first and foremost, this is a math problem. You need 218 votes to pass a bill out of Congress, out of the House, where there are 215 Democrats. So that math doesn't change. So in order for us to pass something, we would have to have the majority Republicans bring forth a bill, and then we'd have to get three Republicans to want to vote for something that all Democrats would vote for. So first of all, it's a math problem. But here's what I tell folks. I said, what we can do is a few things. We need to show up and use our voices because a lot of times in places like DC, you're in this bubble, right? You're in this bubble of people who know policy, you're in a media bubble, and we have to know how these things are affecting everyday people. The other thing I also say too is that, I do everything I can to work in a bipartisan way without compromising my values, but we have to hold the Republicans accountable. They are allowing Donald Trump to make all these illegal actions. They're doing nothing, they're staying silent, and they're complicit. So I appreciate having people say to me, do something. But what I say back is if you want to do something productive, tell the story of how this is hurting people and hold the Republicans accountable, even if you don't vote for them, because they still make decisions.
I know you don't have a list in front of you, and it tends to change. It's in flux a little
Right.
bit. But off the top of your head, what do we know or think we know we lose in this area when it comes to Doge reductions? There's a lot of money for green infrastructure coming out of the Inflation and Inflation Reduction Act,
Right.
which I still maintain is slightly ironically named. Library money, that was a story that just came out.
Right.
What are you aware of that is at risk, again, kind of in our local situation?
So I will tell you honestly, it's always hard to tell day to day. But if I think about some of the initial cuts that were made, for example, they made cuts to the federal aviation industry, right? And then they said, "Oh, wait, we want these employees to come back." They made some cuts to Veterans Administration employees who are helping our veterans every single day. And they said, "Oh, wait, we want you to come back." And so I would say the everyday impact of this, Tom, is that they're making cuts, they're getting a lot of negative publicity, and people are complaining. And then they say, "Oh, wait, we don't want to do that." And what's happening is that you're losing people with institutional knowledge who understand how these agencies work. How does that help hurt you as an everyday person? The wait times at Social Security are going to be a lot longer than they have been because they're decimating the agencies and closing regional offices. Getting care at the Veterans Administration is going to get harder because if you want to improve customer service, you don't take away the people who are actually doing the work. And so I did some of the other things that are happening too is Department of Education cuts, right? They are cutting the Department of Education. In real time, that's going to mean that kids who get Title I funds in schools that are underserved, services for special ed students, services in community and technical education, those funds are all at risk. And so these agencies that they are attacking are not going to help us reduce the debt because they're doing harm to the American people. So those are just some specific examples I have.
And I circle back to this idea of a commission on the national debt. And with 435 plus 100 people on that commission, we can't cut anything. It's all essential. It's all vital. We know that's not
Well,
true,
yeah.
but man, we gotta balance these two ideas somehow.
Yeah, and I would also say too, I mean, when we think about national debt, it's not just taking a chainsaw to every government program. The other question is, where are there opportunities to generate revenue? I'm not just talking about taxes, right? Is investing in communities and infrastructure going to be better for commerce? That will be more tax revenue. So be thoughtful, be strategic, and think about both the expense side, but also think about the revenue side as well. They're not mutually exclusive. They can work together.
So the commission could come out and maybe talk about taxes and have some political cover. Yeah, it's something to think about.
Yeah, and also too, I'll talk about Social Security, for example. When Social Security started, there were 16 employees contributing into the system for every one beneficiary getting
Yeah.
benefits. That ratio is so different now. I think it might be 4 to 1. And so we have to look at Social Security. And one place I think is a good place to look, like, what is the cap as far as where you contribute into Social Security? We can raise the cap, we can eliminate it altogether, but that's one idea that's out there about how we keep Social Security and ensure that everyone's benefits are going to be there because they paid into it and they've earned these benefits.
Yeah, there's a couple of levers there that can be pushed and pulled, none too
Yep.
dramatically, that can certainly have major implications down the road on that program. Marilyn, thanks so much for coming to Northwest Now. I appreciate your time today.
Great. Nice to see you again, Tom.
You too.
And now let's move north into the 2nd District and Congressman Rick Larsen.
Just as Boeing is stopped beating up its suppliers and getting in line and working in conjunction with labor and getting back to an engineering and safety focus, wow, here comes an international trade war and China really taking a step back from products that are crucial to Congressional District 2 in Washington State. Talk a little bit about what you're hearing, what's going on, and what do you think some of the long-term impacts of this have the possibility of being?
Well, I'm fortunate enough to be the congressman who represents more Boeing employees and retirees than any other member of Congress in the United States. And they do great work. They build great airplanes. They've been through a really tough time. The company's been through a tough time as well. And the main focus for Boeing largely right now is on this thing called the safety and quality plan. That is basically the work that they need to do to increase their production rates again, to hire more people, and so on. So this ongoing trade war that the president has brought upon the United States isn't helping. The U.S.-China trade relationship was already in pretty tough shape. China the government in China clearly believes it's strong enough to withstand a trade war with the United States, and is being very targeted in attacking and creating collateral damage on major U.S. products, including Boeing airplanes. And so, the folks at Boeing, their long-term plan is really about rebuilding trust, building quality, safe airplanes, taking that route, and calculating where the China market sits in this right now. It hasn't been a great market for Boeing or Airbus, frankly, for quite some time. China hasn't. So this is collateral damage that may have a big impact short term, and it may have a bigger impact long term or not. It's really kind of up in the air. But it does show that China feels it's strong enough to push back against the United States and its largest exporter by revenue, and that's Boeing. Those are Boeing airplanes and the women and men who make them.
I understand the principle of trying to bring manufacturing back to the United States. I worked for years out in the Midwest. I've been to many towns with the empty factory and no more textiles, no more auto parts, no more you name it, furniture. And, we made a deal with the devil back in the 70s and 80s to get cheap stuff in exchange for selling out American labor. So I understand the principle of it. Is this being carried out strategically, do you think, or do you think it's a mess and we're going to see what happens?
I think the president's trade war is a mess. It's creating chaos. There's really no strategy to it. When he first announced the increase on tariffs using these national emergency powers, it was so chaotic. We were putting tariffs on an uninhabited island, a couple of islands inhabited only by penguins. That's just an example of sort of the spaghetti on the wall approach that the president has taken. The flip side of this is that manufacturing jobs, the number of manufacturing jobs in the U.S. has increased over time. We have increased manufacturing jobs. We are investing in our transportation system with the passage of the bipartisan infrastructure law. There's a reason why the unemployment rate has been hovering as low as 3.9% over the last couple of years, because women and men are going to work every day in construction, building the next generation infrastructure. There are things we're doing with the CHIPS and Science Act that are investing in the United States. I would argue this president could have left things alone, and it wouldn't be chaotic. Things would be going pretty well, and people wouldn't be panicking about their 401ks or about the price of gas or the price of eggs. But that's where we are right now.
Yeah, and the emphasis there being, let's face it, we're never going to make ping pong balls or tennis shoes in this country again, but high value things do have a continuing role. And I think the president's idea there is, listen, I'm going to give manufacturers a high price as opposed to government money. Two major differences in philosophy there. I get that, but you mentioned the word chaos, and that's a good segue into another question I have for you. What are constituents telling you about chaos? Here at KBTC and public television, we're having difficulty planning, not knowing what's going to happen with the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. And the same thing is happening with personal finance and families, small business, imports, exports. What does that policy chaos mean on the ground for the non-Boeings in District 2?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm a big fan of public television. I watch my Masterpiece Mysteries. I think the investment it's a very tiny investment the government makes in the Corporation for Public Broadcasting to support public television. It's also a very tiny investment the federal government makes in our local libraries, and yet now libraries are being hit because of a cut to a program that is the way it's going to play out is exacerbating the rural digital divide. Rural libraries use this federal money in order to bring free Wi-Fi to rural areas for their customers, for their taxpayers, for kids, for students. Without that money, Wi-Fi in rural areas is going to be degraded, and it means less access to educational materials for local kids. People are concerned about Medicaid cuts. Medicaid cuts are coming. because of the chaos in the budget. In Whatcom County, as for instance, in 2023, 50% of the kids born in Whatcom County in 2023 were born into families that use Medicaid as a primary health care. In Skagit County, it's 60%. So what I want to tell people is, like, Medicaid is not health care for the poor. You don't have to play more than 2 degrees of Kevin Bacon to find someone who uses Medicaid as their primary health care, or a friend of a friend. It's going to hit people in your neighborhood when these cuts happen. And finally, I just note that this president came in, he said he's going to cut gas prices on day one. In Everett, where I live, the gas prices are up 65 cents since Inauguration Day. Now, is that the president's fault? I don't know if it is the president's fault or not. He promised they'd come down, and he's breaking the promise. All this focus on the chaos it means the president is not focused on doing the very thing he got elected to do, and that was address costs and inflation for average Americans. He's not doing it.
A lot of state costs in the state of Washington going into the price of gas. The cost of oil is going down, and answers for things like putting trade barriers on small islands is to avoid transshipment problems.